I'm completely fine with that. Like some of my favorite conversations, people are like, these questions are dumb. They're just general questions for lots of different intersections. So it's a great starting place.
Yeah.
But feel free to go where going needs, if that makes sense. All right, so let me pop this up.
How do I take this away? Oh, that's great.
And feel free, if you ever have a thing that needs a trans person, I'll come be your panelist for whatever that
Oh my
thing
gosh,
might
please.
be, right? Yeah.
I'm
it's
like
good reciprocity.
I'm just trying to get where I thought Jehu's table was and where they actually are is not the same.
Yeah.
And that happens frequently, right? Like people talk up their church, and like Lenny is one of my best friends. So like I trust him. I partnered alongside him as he was creating Jehu's table, but it's one thing I think in at least in my community that it's one thing to have a queer pastor who is married to a partner of the opposite sex than it is to have a queer pastor that is married to someone of the same sex or partnered with someone of the same sex. I think it's a little more in your face.
Yeah.
That's not going to stop me.
Yeah.
But
well, you learn a lot of different stuff about like expectations of pastors' partners and how much people really meant it, right? Sometimes it's easier on paper than it is in the flesh.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. We did it.
Yay.
I'm so glad I made it back. So glad I made it back. I was so sad to be rushing right beforehand, but now that I'm here, I'm like, yes, this is where we need to be.
So, I wasn't even worried.
I'm stoked.
I was just here hanging out.
Just hanging out. It's gonna be great.
Watching some videos of drag queens, waiting.
Ooh, yes.
Waiting patiently, and like hopefully I can finish this video.
Yes. Yeah. One of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence sent to our house during this quarantine, because my kids like to make Instagram live videos telling everyone that they can make it. And so one of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence sent presents to my kids to like encourage them to keep making these fabulous videos. So they sent like a piñata full of candy, which is a great idea if you're not the parent of said child stuck in the house from quarantine, right? We don't have a backyard, so they're just running it off in the house.
You're like,
and then sent a giant tube of glitter like this big, which is also fabulous, except, you know, if you glitter anyone, it's still in your living room. Yep. And so it has made our things much more fabulous, but in a very messy way. So it's those drag queens get you every time.
I know. They're like, we have glitter, you're gonna have it too.
Yeah. Like, we love them though. Yeah. Welcome everyone who's gathering. We're going to start in about 1 minute at 2:00 Pacific Standard Time. Is it 5:00 your time?
Sure is. I was very confused at first, and I've lived in California. I have like a huge California tattoo of the state. Like, nice. I love California, but after not being there for a couple of years, I'm like, what time is it there?
What time is it? Yeah. Well, here you are, everyone, and I'm glad to have you. Welcome to our town hall, talking about ways we can minimize bias in the Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Megan from Grace Lutheran in San Francisco. For those who are joining us on the Zoom webinar, we are in webinar mode, which means that not everyone has video, not everyone has voice. We're trying to center our attention where we are listening today, and also trying to minimize the likelihood that someone will intentionally interrupt our conversation. If you would like to lift up questions today, please put those in the Q&A section of the webinar. But if you forget, I'll try to also monitor the chat. If you are watching us on Facebook Live, you can use either #LutheransListen or just post right in the chat any questions that you might have, and I will lift them up. We try to remember each week that the folk we are listening to are speaking for themselves and not necessarily representing any of the many intersections that they embody or places where they worship. And we also try to remember that because we are recording this, that if in the future at some point there's better language and better terminology for some of the stuff we're talking about, assume we've grown and changed since the time that we recorded this. And this is just a moment in time in October of 2020, a way that we kind of saw the world. And we also invite the Holy Spirit to live with us and be with us in this conversation, but also to remember that technology hiccups happen. I have kids, so who knows what could happen at any point. But we're all kind of living through these wacky times together. And with that, I'll invite our guest to introduce themselves.
So hi, my name is Pastor Kelsey Brown. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm coming at you live from Brooklyn, New York. It's gorgeous here today and very sunny, as you can see. I have no lights on. This is all the sun. It also is very loud in Brooklyn. So if you hear some sirens, people shouting outside, that's what we do here. I'm the pastor of Jehu's Table, a African descent worshiping community of the Metro New York Synod, a mission start. And it is my joy and privilege to be their pastor. I am very, very recently ordained, and this is my first call, but being a lifelong Lutheran and someone who has worked as the youth representative on the Synod Council when I was in high school. Being a Lutheran is what I know, what I'm sometimes good at.
Well, that's the good thing about being Lutheran. It doesn't matter if we're good at it, we still get to be it, right?
So true.
Will you tell people what a mission start is in case they don't know?
Yeah, so technically, because I'm the second pastor to pastor Jehu's Table, I didn't create it out of the top of my head. Our former pastor, Reverend Lenny Duncan, decided to partner with the Synod to revamp and recreate a new thing in a congregation that had been longing to do a new thing for a while. And Jehu's Table was created, named after Jehu Jones is what I want to say his last name is, but like, who really knows? But yes, who was the first African descent Lutheran pastor, minister in the Lutheran Church in general. So we pay homage to him as a Black worshiping community in the heart of Brooklyn, and invite folks to do the same as they come into our space, acknowledging what we're about and what we hope to be about in the future.
And would you be willing to share some of the intersections that you personally embody with folks?
Oh, yeah, of course. So I am a native New Yorker. I feel like that is an intersection in and of itself. I identify as queer. I'm biracial. My mom is Irish and Dutch. My dad is Black. And although I use the term Black to describe myself frequently, I'm a young person, a cisgender woman. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's it. There's some more stuff like politically, socially in my life, but those are kind of the main ones that I claim and take up space in.
How do those intersections shape your faith, if at all?
So one of my favorite things about growing up Lutheran and growing up Lutheran in an African descent Lutheran congregation is that I was able to witness womanist theology and the like really strong intricacies that come with being an African descent worshiping congregation in the whitest denomination in the United States. So I got all of the like the Black Jesus pictures. Like I was not strapped by any way to not see Jesus the way that I wanted to see Jesus. And that was a great privilege. But I think now where I'm at in my life, being queer is something that's really important to my ministry. I think that queer folks have a really awesome way of looking at the wideness of scripture, the wideness of God's love. I think as a woman and as a woman of African descent, I have found strong community in my siblings of faith in saying, like, this is an issue that I'm having. And typically, as a Black woman in the ELCA, there are many women that know exactly what I'm going through, and I have found great support in that. One of the biggest joys that I couldn't have even imagined being called to be the pastor of Jehu's Table was we have a really strong female leadership in the congregation, and it has been amazing to watch strong Black women stand up for their church, to want to do things to push the church forward. And I think that they see a lot of similarities in me that I see in them and that we see in following Christ, that I look forward to church. I look forward to praying and praising and worshiping with that community, because our intersections lead us to sometimes the same conclusions. And that's really helpful to not have to overly explain myself, or to be able to kind of code switch into language that my community might greater understand from me than from another pastor.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think the general kind of scope of Lutherans. I grew up in South Dakota, where being Lutheran is cultural, kind of for some Jewish folk in New York, it's about the culture and the pastries, right? Less than the religious practices. And that for me was where I was as a Lutheran, kind of prior to becoming a pastor. And I can imagine that if you're orientated in one very strong culture in a geographic point in the United States, wherever that geographic point is, you really can believe this is how all Lutherans talk. This is how all Lutherans eat. This is how all Lutherans gather in community. And then to know that there are folk who are feeling like they literally have to translate in order to be in communities like that, right? To do code switching is something that not everyone really thinks about very often. So I'm really grateful that you lifted up that and named it.
There's also a long-standing joke. Anyone that I've told this to, and I think I was being like vulnerable in sharing this in a variety of settings, but the dean at my seminary, whenever I was around and he would introduce me to people and quote this, I didn't know that white Lutherans existed until I was like 10. So the only white Lutheran I knew was my mom and one other woman from my home congregation, who were both married to Black men, who had children that were biracial. So they were enveloped in our community in a very real way that I didn't even clock that. Like, I didn't even acknowledge that. I was like, oh, that's just my mom. She used to be Catholic. She's not now. But it wasn't until I met Reverend Elise Brown at a church camp that I was like, you? She was also the first female pastor I had ever met. So my world was rocked a little bit that day on, women can do, other people can do this except men. Other people can do this except my pastor in my church. And it was really awesome.
I'm really grateful that you had that experience, because I think there's a lot of Lutherans that don't know how many, like in the 1700s, East Coast Lutheran settlement churches were entirely Black led,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's so wonderful to have kind of celebration and joy of that spirit. It reminds me, so I have two young Black children, and whenever my kids see a mayor in a movie on TV, they're like, white people get to be mayors? Because in San Francisco, we have a Black female mayor, we have a Black police chief, right? We have so much leadership right now that looks like them, that it never occurred to them that leadership didn't look like them. And so
Yeah.
I'm digging that there's a VP right now. They're like, of course, like,
Why wouldn't she? Yeah.
that's right. And so I'm trying to be like, watch this, it's historic. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. We
No,
grew up
not
with a Black president. We're fine. Like,
Yeah.
so I just love that. I love that there are people who get to live fully affirmed lives, kind of not knowing that there's, I know I saw the blue lights outside your window.
It's my TV's flashing.
Okay.
Everything's going wrong. This is how loud the music is sometimes. I'm like, why is that? That must hurt your ears in your car if I can really hear every word.
I thought there was maybe like a first responder emergency, but now it looks a little bit more disco light. So I'm less concerned for you.
Yeah, I feel like I should get up and shut it off. Flashing lights can be triggering. Let me know if it's an issue.
Okay, yeah. Text us if you're having any flashing lights issues, folk. So during the time of our town halls, we started, I think this is week 19 in a row that we've been listening to voices. And so we started by listening to kind of panels of people who are of similar populations. We've listened to Latinx folk, we've listened to Native folk, we've listened to folk from the Black community, we've listened to LGBTQ folk, different genders, different disability levels, different types of Lutheran trainings, from the deaconess community to the teen program. And then we shifted from collecting the biases that people had experienced to trying to collect ways that things have been worked out, or collecting best practices that people have done. And we listened to a bunch of bishops. We've listened to a couple of different groups, and now we're kind of slowing down as we're listening to kind of focus on just like one person at a time of what they're noticing, because I think this is kind of the sweet spot of where people are wanting to live their faith and improve themselves, improve their communities, improve the systems of justice. And so what we've been doing with people is just talking with them about either things that you've noticed or ways you wish things would improve in terms of decreasing bias. And we think about it in terms of kind of an individual journey, a local congregation journey, and a church-wide journey. Would you be willing to start with that first bit, which is how people can work on themselves and how they can decrease their own biases? What are your thoughts on that?
So I really struggle with that question, and I'll tell you a little bit why. So I'm a firm believer that it is not the requirement of folks of various communities to do the teaching for folks who are not part of those communities but want to do better. But I also acknowledge that everyone gets to start where they start. And I can't fault someone for starting at a place that's different than mine, specifically around race, because I've grown up in a very real intersection between my family that's Black and my family that is non-Black. And that's tough. That's a lot of identity to struggle with, like, in your family, let alone just like out in the world. So I know those feelings very well. I've had to teach my mom like why Black Lives Matter, even though my mom has 5 Black children. So I have to have this acknowledgement that everyone gets to start where they start. But where you start shouldn't dictate where you think you can go. So in ELM, Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, I am on their board of directors, and some of the language that we've been using recently to talk about folks' journeys in decreasing their own bias is asking the first question is why? Why do I think bias should be decreased? Why do I think I want to engage in this work? And everyone gets to answer that for themselves. And then from why, we step into the how. I think that each person that is committed to decreasing their own personal bias needs to start at that why place. And if you personally don't have a why, look around. There are many whys out there. Sometimes it just means opening your eyes, for a lack of a better term, to who's around, who's not around. I also think that when you enter in from the why to the how, you need to check in with yourself and say, how much risk am I willing to take on decentering my bias and learning from folks of marginalized communities? Like, what is the risk that I'm willing to take? And for folks who have a lot of money, that may be, I'm willing to donate or allocate this amount of funds. For folks who maybe money is not where they feel called to decrease their bias from, then maybe it's, where am I willing to put my body on the line? Am I willing to go stand at a protest? Am I willing to bring my body to the office of a congressperson? And once you decide for yourself, I don't think there's any way for someone to decide for you how you're willing to show up. But I think when you get to that place, then you can move from how to maybe when. When can I carve out time to do this work? It's definitely not a sprint. It is a lengthy marathon. And if you pull yourself too tight from the get-go, you leave minimal room for you to go to. And we need people that are willing to be on this journey till the end. Not that I really know where or when that end will be. It's very clear that it's been 400 plus years and we're still on the journey. But I think once you get that why and that how, it leaves room for yourself, your own journey to kind of branch off. And don't compare yourself to other people's journey. I think that's really important in a society that kind of lifts up wokeness, as in like, oh, that person really knows what they're talking about. They put their body on the line, they put their money on the line, they put their voice on the line. They must know. I'll never know. Yeah, comparing yourself to another person's journey in any way is just not very helpful.
In one of our conversations when we were listening, there was an individual who called us to participate in reparations, and their language for how they talked about it was, I think, packaged in a way that a lot of Lutherans can understand, just because like global warming was a language they already were on board with, and environmental justice was language they were already on board with, and so Angela Jenkins talks a little bit about how you can decrease your bias footprint in the way that you would pay funds to decrease your carbon footprint, that people can think about donating funds as a way to decrease their bias footprint. Like you feel bad, but it's not appropriate for you to go talk to a community you just had an unfortunate microaggression with. So like make a commitment to do reparations each time you kind of step in a place you wish you wouldn't have stepped. I tell you that long story to ask you this follow-up, which is, as a pastor at a kind of nativity embryonic ministry place, right, for whom I imagine financial support is useful in kind of growing your work. If people are thinking about like decreasing bias through financial redistribution, what thoughts do you have about how people engage with your community? Like, if they just send a check with no explanation, is that cool because it still cashes? Do you prefer people try to engage in your community in some sort of way? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think in our digital age, specifically during the time of COVID, funds are really important. Not only do they keep the lights on, keep the building okay while we're away from the building, but I'm not one to mince words when I say that like funds help. Like it's sometimes like I'm not engaging in conversation with folks for the hopes that they will donate or tithe to Jehu's Table. However, I do believe that African, like ethnic specific ministries in the ELCA, a real way to show a changing of heart or a movement towards decreased bias, that funds can't be a part of that, because I think that they can. Not only does it show, I believe in your ministry as a congregation of African descent, I believe in your community. Jehu's Table is in the East New York community of Brooklyn, and it's notoriously a tough community. I think the people that live there would say it's a community full of hope and of what could happen there. I would like to think that Jehu's Table serves as a beacon of what church could look like in a place such as East New York. But we're only able to do our ministry if we have the building and the financial support to keep inviting folks into conversation, to feed folks in our community, to buy books for kids in our community, to be able to see themselves in the content that they're reading and involved in. However, I don't know the best way to do that. I don't know if sending money is enough. I think that I'm less focused on, oh, you just sent money, to like silence away the issue, as opposed to like, hey, this is some personal work that I've been doing. This is synodically what I've been involved in or congregationally, and to say, I'd like to like allocate some funds to this community who I believe is giving back to the people that they serve, or providing a beacon of hope to the communities that they serve. No matter what it is, if it's food donation, time donation, funds, every little bit helps in bringing Christ's message back into the world. I think that's what Jehu's Table is committed to. I think that's a big commitment from a lot of African descent churches, is like, how can we continue to impact those who come after us, or those that are in our congregations now? One of the greatest things that my pastor ever did for us as youth was take us on college tours, to say like, this can be yours. We went to Harvard, like a group of 10 Black kids from Long Island just strolled up in a church van at Harvard. And we saw that there's more to life than what our community maybe says, or what the world says about us. He couldn't have done that without donations. We drove to Boston. We got t-shirts. Everyone got a Harvard t-shirt. We got to really feel like we were a part of something. We visited my alma mater twice, and it's the reason that I went there. A small Lutheran school, Wagner College in Staten Island. Yeah, like I think that because of those things, I was able to see myself taking on a role in ministry that I had no idea I would ever take on. I went to college thinking I was going to be a nurse, that being a healthcare professional was the only way that I could help people. But because of his commitment to showing us a different side of life, a different pathway, and through the funds that he collected to take us there, I was able to see I can shoot for the stars. And if I fall, God's got me. Let's take as many chances as possible. I think ministry is a chance. It's a risk. The candidacy process in the ELCA is a risk. But I'm glad to be on the other side of it now.
Yeah, congrats. I'm glad too.
Thank you.
It's a long, hard, expensive, sometimes slog. And so,
Ooh.
right?
Yeah, my mom used to say, why aren't you just a doctor? 8 years of schooling, you've already done, like, why wouldn't you just be a doctor? My, like, faithful Lutheran mother. No.
She's not wrong.
I know. I know. That's the hardest part. I'm like, you're right, but God's calling me to do this thing right now.
I know. Pray for all of us. That's the only answer to that. We've had 2 different people ask about the best way to connect. I think because people are maybe inspired to donate. So it's Yehu's Table, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
JEHU, and I just put the link in the chat. I assume that there's a place where they can donate on your website. Is that the best place for them to go?
There is. That would be the best. I think we have a donate button. So that would be the best way. Also, you can find out a little more about me, a little more about our mission. You can find out good things on the website.
Yeah. It's a nice website. I liked it too.
We try.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of particularly in anti-racist work. What I've been hearing from a lot of different groups within kind of the realm of anti-racist work is we're not going to give you permission to be done, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever activity it is that you do to decrease your bias, we're not going to give you permission to be done after you complete that activity. We're not also going to we're not going to say do this thing and to assume that doing that thing is going to be helpful or useful. And I think there is an ever-present expectation that people will move and do some things, knowing that the risk of doing it wrong is exactly the space that people should be walking into, rather than going into a place of like, we checked the boxes, we hung up the sign, we did all of the things. And so I appreciate that kind of nudging way of reminding people that the march is long and we're all going to get there, and drink water and stay hydrated.
Amen.
Right. But and keep marching. Right. Yeah.
One step is a good thing.
No, go ahead. Exactly.
Well, I was gonna say one step is great, but keep going.
Right.
I know you're not walking alone, right? Like we're all trying to do the work.
Yeah. So that's kind of some thoughts for the individuals who are decreasing their bias, looking at their who's, what's, and their when's, where's, and their why's. Mm-hmm. What about faith communities, church communities? What are some things that faithful gathering folk can do together to decrease their biases?
Have conversation is probably my number one tip. And if you have to have painful conversation, which frequently the work of stretching can be painful, don't do it at a marginalized person's expense. So I try really hard if there's tough things kind of coming at me, if I'm doing a Q&A and it's not, I want you to talk to me about this because I want to learn, and it's more accusatory, that I'm just like, no, Google is your friend. white allies and colleagues that are doing the work are your friends. Black folks and marginalized folks are your friends, but they're not your teachers, right? And there are a plethora of books out there. There are a plethora of TED Talks out there if you're more a virtual person, YouTube videos, even Netflix on just like the work, as I like to call it. That doesn't mean that I won't lend my voice to conversations, because I want things to get better. I've always wanted things to get better. Even since I was a young child, I've always been an empath who can pick up on folks. And I always want to mitigate pain in the world, in the church, in our various communities, and in all of the intersections that I take up. But I think that having conversation is like a start. Then I would probably say, specifically to congregations that are in the midst of call processes, take the brave choice. Like, invite folks of marginalized communities who are called and claimed, who have passed all the tests and done the work. Give them a chance. I also say that in all of the intersections that I take up space in, is like, we're just as called and qualified. Sometimes taking a risk to have a pastor that looks different than you, talks different than you, moves in the world different than you, can be a real way, at least in the ways that I pastor, to form relationship, which I think actively helps folks decrease their biases throughout conversation and friendship and mutuality. I think that is what I would say, maybe congregationally. Watch films together, engage in like deep and meaningful conversation on, maybe you have someone in your congregation who has struggled with decreasing their bias, but then through various acts has said, oh, I see this, I identify why I should do this, and my how is having conversations with other folks who may have been where I was at, talking through with folks in maybe one-to-ones. How have you come to identify your why? And just being able to talk honestly. Like I said before, everyone gets to start where they start. So if a congregation is starting at one place, model a congregation who's at another place, but be genuine in that modeling. I think that a lot of congregations like to think that they are further than they are. Be honest with where you're at, because if you're not, and you invite marginalized folks into that community, they will suffer because of where they thought you were and where you actually are. And I fully believe that as a Christian, much of our commitment to living out Christ's message in the world is minimizing harm wherever possible.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think in some of the like language of the paperwork we do as Lutheran, like the yearly forms we fill out for synods, like some of that language is wedded to a previous, maybe an assumption that most people in your congregation are going to be white kind of language, and so some of those hidden coded things that are about what's going on in your neighborhood, like how long have people lived in your zip code, right? Kinds of questions, and there are just some like strange ways that the language kind of weds us to a bias that maybe we don't even necessarily claim in our spaces. And so I have found that oftentimes the like negative moments get the most attention. Like you were mentioning, that person who's got a ways to go and doesn't want to go there might get so much of the church's attention. But I liked the way that you were talking about, like, just start modeling this new way, like have a positive thing that you're showing that vision of what this looks like, and not just only putting out fires all the time, or not waiting for something yucky to happen to clean it up. You're doing proactive stuff to have authentic conversations regardless of what's going on with where people kind of are in your community. Like, this is the beloved community, let's live in it. So I just wanted to name that kind of positive way of talking about rebuilding and revisioning and having growth together, that I don't always hear in the, I ask this question a lot, right? How do we decrease bias in congregations? And I think that's one of the most positive ways I've heard it put, is to just like start living it, one movie, one conversation at a time. So
yeah, if we wait for a catastrophic event for that to be the way that we start, there are so many things that matter more than for my community than Black death, Black joy, Black sadness. Like there are so many things deeper to call us out to do this work than just when someone's life is taken.
Yeah.
And it's okay to do, like, it's okay to have joy in those things, to learn from people who are using joy as resistance. We don't have to just use sadness and death to say that we matter or that Christ is present there, because Christ was present in a lot of joy too. Yeah. And that's what I always tell people. I know that when things are in the news, when things are part of the rumor mill, that may seem like a time to fight the good fight, but the fight goes on whether we're in the news or not.
Yeah. Well, and this work isn't just Lenten work. Oof. Right? This is Easter work more than anything. And if it's about resurrection and new possibilities and new heavens and new earths and heavens that already were there, but just we had horse blinders on, right? Then we got to stop only showing up at funerals and show up at banquets and and other community moments that celebrate that full range of joy. I think that's a really lovely way to think about that, for sure. What do you think about church structures, bishops and synods and church-wide spaces? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah. So being involved synodically as a youth, I got to see like the inner workings of a synod very young, in a different way than I think many of my colleagues prior to being ordained even saw the workings of a synod. I never wanted to believe that the church was about money. I never, ever wanted to believe that the power structure was a trickle down. I really wanted to believe that folks were here and doing the work and loving their neighbor just because they wanted to, not because there was any incentive for them to be there. But I will also say that I've had the joy and opportunity to work closely with many bishops in the ELCA, and that I have found great commitment to listening from many of the bishops of the ELCA. And that's like hope-filled for me, to know that folks who were elected and entrusted to this office by the wider church also have the humility to say, I don't have all the answers, and I'd really like to listen to how I can do better. I think that on their best day, church-wide, church with a capital C, is trying to listen and do better. And on their worst day, I think that it's really easy to fall back into, well, this is the way it's always gone. This is the way it's always been, because the way that it's always been is wrong. Like the way that it's always been has uplifted systems of white supremacy, has uplifted patriarchy, has uplifted homophobia in real ways, real ways. But I also think that as the movement shifts and grows, as people start to find their why, that we're trying to do better. The systems are trying to do better. That doesn't mean that they won't fail, but it does mean that more and more folks are ready to take the risk, and that is really, really it serves me and finds me really hopeful in that work. I think that sometimes when we listen, and I do this frequently as an Enneagram 2, is sometimes when we listen, we're already crafting our response in our head. And sometimes listening, to really listen, is hard, because we're like, oh no, no, I'm okay. I'm an ally. I'm a friend. I'm doing the right thing. But listening is work too, not just the doing. And that listening doesn't mean we're always going to get it right either. My call to the church is to take people seriously. Listen to experiences of marginalized folks in the church, and don't respond just based off of being hurt by what is said or unsaid in regards to the institution. Instead, validate real human beings' experiences, even if they're different from what you've experienced, and listen to the ways in which they believe a step forward might work. Now, that doesn't mean that marginalized folks are always going to have the correct answer either. But like you said when we started this, we're only informed off of what we have when we have it. Right now, Friday, October 9th, 2020, with all of the baggage that this year has brought, with all of the horrors that this year has brought to the forefront of just how broken our world is, just how broken and easily friable our communities are, how church isn't a building, which is a shock to people. And instead to say, God is doing a new thing. What is broken can be made mosaic. What is broken is not the end, because we still have the Holy Spirit, the Spirit that comes alongside us to rebuild. There's a reason why Andrea Gibson, a spoken word poet, they talk about their time in New Orleans in saying there are still places that are boarded up saying we'll open soon. There is still space in the time and place that we are in right now to rebuild. This is not the end. This is not the end of times. This is just the end of what is old, breaking way for what is new. And that new can be scary. New can be fascinating. New can pull us and stretch us to places that we didn't think we could go, but that we're not doing it alone. That God is right alongside us in the ways that God continues to proclaim throughout Scripture. I am making all things new. That is, I think, what I see when I think about what's going on at the capital C. church level right now.
And again, it was so hopeful. That was amazing.
I try. I have my days that I can go to the pessimist side very quickly. But today I'm feeling hopeful. In conversation with you, I'm feeling hopeful. So why not?
Yeah, well, I feel hopeful too, because I mean, when I was doing my doctorate of ministry research, I was studying the ways that pastors organized in the late 60s and early 70s, a similar time of anti-racist work being done, a similar time of gender work kind of being pushed, a similar time of sexual orientation, boundaries and edges being moved. And what gave me a lot of hope around that is that there are very few times in history when when the folk who, when they were young adults and youth, protested the same things that the young adults are protesting now, that they might be at the head of the boards and the councils and the power structures. And so I have so much hope for our church, because even if folk are having to learn how to do that same justice work now as you readjust because the sun wanted to bless you. I know. It came like at the perfect time though, because you were right in the midst of the Holy Spirit shining out of you like Moses's forehead, and then the sun came and was like, I'm blessing this thing that's happening right now. No, it was good. But so I think a number of the people who have been listening to this, at least so far as folk have been filling out surveys and providing comments later, were deeply engaged in this work in their youth, right? In the 60s and 70s and 80s. And now it is the same work that they have the heart and the passion for, but maybe their bodies work differently now. Maybe their ability to go out in the middle of a pandemic is a little bit harder. And so people are they have the heart for how to be engaged, but they're starting again with relearning what the language is of this generation and wanting to figure out how they can kind of empower people to go out in the world. And that leaves me really hopeful that there are so many more people on the march than you see at the march, if that makes any sense, right?
So true. Because things are not accessible. We still have a long way to go with shaming folks who aren't on the ground as if the only way to show up is with your body. That's something that the more that I get involved with work and listening to my friends with various disabilities, I realize that to shame someone for the ways in which they can show up and just not to rejoice that they're showing up in the first place is a disservice to any movement.
Well, so the next question that I want to ask you is, so born out of this heart that people have a heart for this work, for decreasing their bias, for being anti-racist, but they might or might not have the language yet. So are there things that you wish people would stop asking you and research on their own?
Oh, yeah. Pronouns. And I say that as like a cis person too. Like, I have seen recently, within the past couple of days, just infighting on pronouns. And that's something that I think is such a basic level of respect. When I talk to people as a cis person about pronouns, I always say that when I was a kid, my name is Kelsey, Kelsey. This was before Kelsey was a popular name, that my parents named me Kelsey. However, people would choose to call me Chelsea. And I would always say, that's not my name. I would wear a name tag. As a young child, I had an eye patch to fix some things that were going on with my vision. I would put little stickers with my name on them on the eye patch, and I would correct people, and they would still choose to get it wrong. Your name matters. Your pronouns matter, your gender matters, not only to the people that you engage with, but to God. So to say, oh, well, I don't use those, or I don't really know how that works. There are people that do know how that works. And a quick Google search will show you how to integrate updated language. Although I would argue that pronouns are not updated language. We've been calling things for a very long time. But that's really hard for me to see. And it brings out some anger in me. Because again, I just want to respect people. I want to meet people where they're at and not use excuses to causing harm. Oh, I don't understand. Well, at times I didn't understand. So instead of saying, I don't understand, I listened to people and I changed my mind. As a theologian, as a pastor, one of my greatest ways and lenses to see scripture, or to, especially when I'm sermonizing, is through process theology, where God changes God's mind based on new information. If the creator of all things can change their mind about something, about someone, about previous teachings, then we can do that too. We're human beings with access to much more technology than maybe God had, at least at the very beginning. God does change, but I think that's a joy. It's a joy to be able to say, I didn't know that yesterday, but now that I do, I'm willing to change how I approach tomorrow. I also wish that people, maybe this is just my own community, but I'm being honest with you all. People who say that being biracial, that I will never have the experience of what it means to be Black in the world. That's a real struggle that I have. Growing up with parents of two different races, I was able to see racial bias up close very, very young. 2 years old in the grocery store, someone said, oh, your hair. I used to have hair down to my knees. Oh, your hair is so beautiful. It doesn't even look like Black girl hair. And then they would question my mom, who is sitting in front of me, and say, is that your babysitter? No, that's the lady who gave birth to me. That's my human. I belong to that person, and she belongs to me. I'm tired of the one-upping. This isn't the bias Olympics. This isn't the marginalized Olympics. You don't get to decide my struggle, and I don't get to decide yours. But I honor what you say about your struggle in the same ways that I hope you would honor what I say about my place and position in the world as well. So those are some like major things that kind of grind my gears. When I was younger, I tried to be someone that I wasn't. When I came out, I thought that being a lesbian, which was the terminology that I used then for myself rather than queer, was to be masculine. But that wasn't acceptable to my parents. So I would pack my brother's clothes in my backpack and change when I got to school. Now, my brother is like 5'10", and like maybe like 330 pounds. He'll be mad that I said that online, but he probably won't see this, so it's okay. But I would take a shoelace and use that as a belt to keep his pants up because I thought that's how I had to exist in the world. The older I've gotten, I realize that I am whatever I am when I am it. And that people can be that way too. I'm so tired of, like I said, like the infighting. I'm just trying to be a good human. I recognize when good humans are trying to be good humans. I also recognize that I don't get to decide what a bad human is. That the only judge is God at the end of the day, and that I believe that theology informs me to believe that God is a generous judge, not a vindictive judge or a casual judge. That because we know that God's mind can be changed, that God is a God who just is with us, with even the people that we think God shouldn't be with, that God is still with them. It took me a long time to get there because I'm a human being who exists in the world. But I try and remind myself of that every day, especially when I walk by people on the street not wearing masks. I'm like, oh, God still loves you, even though I'm annoyed.
I was reading the book of Hosea earlier this
Ooh.
week. And I was appreciating that same sentiment in Hosea, because there's this language towards the end of it where it's just like, I'm your God. Y'all kind of suck right now, but I'm going to outlast you and I'm going to love you. I'm going to like reconcile with you, but I'm just going to name y'all suck right now. Like,
Oh.
I mean, and God said it, I mean, in the book of Hosea, God says it a lot angrier than I would have gone to. And so I was appreciating like venting through these ancient words of God just being like, you all are choosing to go back to slavery in Egypt. I don't know why. That's a real dumb choice. I see where you're going, but I guess I'm still your God, but why are you doing that? Right? Like,
and thank God, right? Like literally thank God, because most days I'm not the human that I should be. That doesn't mean that I'm not trying to do better or be better. But I know that when we turn to face God weekly in my congregation during confession and forgiveness, I don't just ask God to forgive me the things that I know I did. I ask God to forgive me the things that I don't know that I did. Because I'm a human that sometimes acts very quickly and then puts my whole foot in my mouth very quickly after. And I'm okay with that.
We're just doing it as models for how you then remove your foot from your mouth and go and repair yourself in the world, right? Yeah.
I think people think that pastors are perfect humans. There's this idea that because, at least in the ELCA, the documents that we sign prior to when we become ordained, at approval, which is step 3.5 of the candidacy process, we say that we'll live a life above reproach. That's tough. That's really tough. It doesn't mean that every day I will succeed at that. It does mean that that's what I aim to do. But in fact, like the real nitty-gritty of the job is just pointing people back to Christ. I won't have all the answers, God does. I won't always get it right, good thing God does. I will sometimes be really mean and rude, but thank God that God continues to pour down love and grace and mercy and understanding. Because some days it's really hard for me to pour that out for myself and for others.
Well, and I think too, sometimes the Holy Spirit gets us to delete the email before we send it, or not tweet the tweet that we're pretty sure needs to be said, because the next day we might not feel that same way. And so I think it's just like kind of trying to, as a pastor, like make the effort to do your best, or to acknowledge when you missed the mark, and to apologize even if those who deserve to apologize more ain't gonna. And it's to just keep coming back every week to say those words that we all need to hear, because we've somehow forgot them from the week before, that God names us and claims us and goes on the journey with us. And that's the whole risk, I think. What helped you, right? Because you named earlier that you're newly ordained-ish, right? What helped you be willing to like take that risk and stick in there on this pastor journey this whole time and make this your vocation instead of getting the more lucrative doctorate degree?
I had friends and mentors that told me I could do it on the days that I doubted the most that I was called to live a life of reproach. My friend said, one foot in front of the other, one day in front of the other, one moment in front of the other. And we did it together. Some of the most valued friendships in my life are friendships that came out of seminary and have sustained all of us now through First Call. I am the last person in my friend group from seminary to get ordained. I don't know why. I have some reasons, maybe why, but this is not the time or place. But nonetheless, the support that I received, even in the periods of intense waiting, told me that I could just make it another day. I think that having you and elders, I use that term lightly, but elders in the faith who came before me to do this work, and knowing that if they can stick around in this, then I can, is how I've been even able to reconcile the job that I have, the vocation that I have. My mentor, Reverend Danielle Miller, she was the first person that told me that I could be a pastor and still be broken, that I didn't have to have it all together, that I could struggle with mental illness, that I could be depressed and have debilitating anxiety and still wake up and put one foot in front of the other. Queer mentors that told me it's not always going to be easy, but it's worth it. It's worth it for the young queer kid who sees me existing in the world, and realizes that they can continue to exist, that it's worth it. And so far it has been. I mean, in a couple of weeks, I'll be ordained a full month, but I'd like to think that the first ordaining that God did in my life was to proclaim me God's, to enter into a partnership with me, a broken person, a human being of the most human, and say, yeah, you too, Kelsey. So I think that sometimes it's hard for people to say, oh, well, you helped me come out 10 years ago, or you helped me as a biracial person take up space in a Black identity 10 years ago. You've been doing this work for a long time, but it is a joy to be publicly recognized for doing that work, to have the stamp of a church and a synod and a capital C church to say, we see you and we support you, continue to do this work in the world. And it's really great to be compensated for that work. I think I felt a little bit of shame at first in acknowledging, like, oh, I've got a lot of debt. Like, I understand that the Holy Spirit is doing a thing. I'll get a call when it's my time to get a call. But in the meantime, God provided, allowed me to have enough food in my stomach, allowed me to have a roof over my head. And I don't take those things for granted. But I do know that because God is making all things new, that I'm going to keep doing it until God says, hang up your hat. Well done, good and faithful servant.
I haven't heard about that kind of call before, but I am also hoping there is a day when God's like, hang up your hat, you're good. Like you did it all.
I don't think it'll happen, but I'm holding out hope.
I was going to say we've had a number of people on Facebook who have who are learning for the first time that there are expectations that pastors live a life beyond reproach, and that there's a form for that. And as someone who was ordained extraordinarily,
Amen.
I did say those words in my vow when I became ordained. So yes, that is a part of what I think about often. I think about that particularly like when I'm at a wedding reception and it's about to go from a wedding reception to kind of sloppy. You know what I'm talking about? That moment. That's the moment when the pastor who made a vow of living a life beyond reproach is like, congratulations on your wedding.
We'll see this pastor of reproach is like, is anybody listening? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, it's not every day.
No, I know.
We try.
But so but what I was going to say is like, there was a lot of stuff that I had to deal with, obviously, right? Like not having the word reverend on my name tag for the first 6 years after I was ordained. But I didn't have to sign that form.
Yeah.
So maybe that was, there was kind of this idea that we were going to live a different kind of life as a pastor. And we knew it was beyond reproach because if one of us got in trouble during that time period, we knew all of the pastors would be done kind of through our LGBTQ time period. And thankfully, that's not the same anymore. We're individual people who get to screw up on our own without needing, one person in a community to do it. But I know because of that journey that for me, it has instilled in me boundaries, pastoral boundaries above and beyond what some of my colleagues that I went to seminary with lived with. And so I'm wondering if that's a part of your experience as well, that you have some very well thought out ways that you are boundaried in the world and living in different parts of different coasts. Obviously the cultural boundaries are different, right? But how did you think about what your personal ethical boundaries would be when you live as a pastor?
One of the things that's been most hard for me and most hard for my partner is the intense preference for pastors to be married. It's something I've talked with colleagues about, with straight cis colleagues, with queer colleagues who are married, is there's this idea, and there frequently has been, not just right now, not just in the ELCA, that folks that are LGBTQIA plus are more promiscuous, are less concerned with setting boundaries. To my, like, living in my truth, in my world, that is not it. That has been one of the hardest things, is acknowledging that I'm not going to let the church force me into a marriage that may not be what it should be for me to feel ready to be married. Like, I've watched colleagues and friends put themselves in harmful marriages because of the church's preference for its pastors to be married. It's something that I've had to push back on. It's something that I've engaged in a lot more conversation than I ever thought I would, because I'm in a long-term committed monogamous relationship that is currently not married. That's something that I've had to reconcile within myself. Is this yearning for marriage because the church is telling me that I should be married, or is it because I love the person that I hope to marry so much that I'm pushing that person into a marriage that maybe they're not ready for? And having to come to terms with that. I've also seen a lot of harm done by folks who are married or are straight or are cisgendered. And that's why I had that call out to the church to say, don't fault me for something that I'm not doing. Instead, I turn the mirror back to the church and say, focus on you over there. I've got it. I'm doing it. I'm existing in the world. We're trying really hard. Marriage does not a good pastor make. So that to me was one of the things that kind of stood out as a life above reproach. But I also think that that language comes steeped in a different culture, in a different time, and in a different place. I think that the language needs to be updated. And that's the hope with the canceling of vision and expectations and changing it into something else, is that like we acknowledge that this language is problematic and has been used to harm people, but we'd like to keep some of it. So we're going to call it a different thing and like maybe add some different language in, but it's basically going to be the same document, right? So I think in part of that harm reduction is acknowledging that words matter, and revamping our language as much as we can to honor the personhood of all people. For the folks that will never be married, but will be amazing pastors. For the folks that have been married and decided mutually to enter out of that marriage, that we're just as called, just as holy, just as pastoral, that we're just doing what we're doing.
I don't think I've ever shared this, but when I was a part of the service in 2010 to be invited to be an ordinary pastor, I don't know what that means, but and we had to have a service of all kinds of stuff, and I was told that I needed to get engaged to the person I had been with for 2 years, or I couldn't participate in the service. And we did get engaged, but then we broke up a couple weeks later because that wasn't where we were organically. Marriage wasn't legal at the time. The church didn't then and doesn't now fully affirm and recognize same-sex marriages. And it broke a relationship. I'm fine. I'm married. I have kids, right? Like, I'm fine. But I have to acknowledge that that was a place where the system of our church, and particularly in that trying to steer people towards these recognized embodiments of and entanglements of being pastors, it broke a relationship, and it's under the guise of binding it together. And so it's just a weird thing to kind of observe and kind of wonder what that's about.
Yeah, the Proclaim gathering, the first one that I went to, which was 2 years ago. For those who may be wondering, Proclaim is like the professional branch of Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, where rostered leaders and seminarians in the ELCA can find mutuality and compassion and care from their colleagues who also identify as LGBTQIA+, and a variety of other intersections. At that gathering, the theme was unbound, I think. And I preached the opening sermon for that gathering, and there are things that are bound that need to be broken. And there are things that are broken that would benefit from binding. Especially in our community, binding has a notion to it, and some intricacies that I think need to be talked about in our communities. However, just because something worked 40 years ago, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago doesn't mean that it works now. The world is constantly changing. Language is being updated. People are more visible or less visible. So I always try and remind people that sometimes things being bound do us a disservice, in the same ways that it did a disservice to that relationship, right? And that we are individuals. To create a covenant for all rostered leaders, acknowledging that we don't all look, sound, act, move throughout the world the same way, is a disservice to the callings, the individual callings that we have heard from God and God has placed on our lives. And that's the same for anti-racist work. That's the same work for anti-fascist work. Is that we don't all look and sound and act the same, but that as we hear in Paul's letter to the folks at Ephesus, out of the book of Ephesians, that the Holy Spirit gives gifts according to each person, and that where I am is maybe not where you are, and where we are is not where another person is, but that's okay. I think that that's the piece that kind of matters the most to me out of the doctrine that we kind of sign our name to when we undertake this beautiful, painful, joyous calling that is being a rostered leader in Christ Church.
Towards the beginning of our talk, I think one of the languages you used in your identifying and talking about how your intersections shaped your faith was womanist theology. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about what womanist theology is for those who aren't as familiar with it.
Oh, I would love, hold on one second.
You're good.
I'm going to find you the most beautiful quote, because I think it sets up womanist theology in a really great way. And it's by Toni Morrison. Let me type it in. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is taking me longer than I thought it would. I should have been doing this. If only I knew you were going to ask that question.
It is exactly as it ought to be. And the comments and the chat, both on Zoom and on Facebook, is gratitude for you, gratitude for your wisdom. Even some folks saying they feel like the hands of the ELCA are in an okay place because you have such wisdom, even so newly ordained. So take the time to type, right?
Yes, I'm like, because I want to get it right. I don't want to just misquote, because I think that this quote is really important. Oh, okay. Let's see. You can have the quote. Okay. I'm just going to read the quote straight off. This is actually a quote from Alice Walker, who first coined the term womanist in around 1979. So it says, a woman who loves other women, sexually or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, women's strength, committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, regardless of gender, not a separatist, except periodically for health. Loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. That's the way that I attempt to describe what it means for me to identify as a womanist. Not all struggles are the same struggle. And the struggle for feminism and being a feminist in the world has typically been more catered to white folk. But in the words of Alice, so many things of what I feel, my connection to other women, not just people that I date, but as a kinship, points me to want to uplift all people. We don't win unless we all win. And even when I'm having a great day, living a great life, I am attuned to the struggle of other folks trying to make it. I think that there is a frequent thought that womanism is a subtype of feminism. But they're the same but different. And as Alice describes, purple to lavender, you can think about that in your head, right? Like, you know, oh, well, they're both purples, but they're different. And that's okay. It's okay that they're different. And as I take space in the world, as I'm subscribing to womanist thought and theology, is the more that I've come to know myself and identify myself as a Black woman, as a child of Black ancestors, of women that birthed and prayed me into existence centuries ago. And that's why I have started to feel connected to that word, that phrase, that ideology over that of just feminist. Because I want to, like I've said throughout this whole thing, I just want other people to succeed. And whatever way that looks like, I am championing whoever's doing it. But that's just me. I'm a big softie. Just hoping the best for all people.
No, but I think sometimes though, like people just need to know that they can do something hard with someone who's going to celebrate that they did something hard,
Ooh.
and not necessarily need the results to be a specific way. And that's, I think, the pastoral lane that you are dwelling in the like I'm going to acknowledge that what you're up to is hard. Someday when you're feeling a little less down about it, I'm going to push you to do more. But like for right now,
Yeah.
I'm just going to like love that you tried and honor your place of being in the world, and we're going to get through this.
Definitely.
Yeah. I loved the hearing again Alice's words about like we're not separatists except for when we need to for healing, I think was her language on that. And so what's your self-care retreat? And you don't have to say all of it if some of it's private, but like what are some of the ways that you refresh and recharge when you need to step back?
I take a lot of naps.
Yes.
I think of sleep as like the key to recharging my battery. Now I do not have a bathtub, but if you were to have asked me just a few years ago, taking like long baths would have probably been the top of the self-care list. Now it means reaching out to my support system, asking for help when I need it. We have a community of Black women in the ELCA that are partnered through a very secret synod, and it's called the Wakanda Synod of the ELCA. Yes, Wakanda forever. I have found the most integral support in my waiting process for ministry came out of that community of Black women who have waited or are still waiting for recognition in this church, who are, instead of lamenting on what they didn't have or the opportunities that they weren't afforded, they point themselves forward to affording those opportunities and fighting for those opportunities for what they lovingly call the younger generation as their like nieces. And at least in my Black community, there is something powerful about having a good auntie. In my lived life, I am blessed by the aunts that I have. But in that community, there's nothing better than getting a card from one of those aunties that says, like, just keep going. Or getting a stole made to say, like, we see you, we've been praying for this call to be recognized publicly, so we've been knitting this together with our prayers and our hopes for you. So that's really where I'm reaching out for self-care. And sometimes it's mindless. Sometimes it's watching too much Netflix or playing too many video games. But that is protecting my health, my mental health, so that I can wake up the next day and continue to do the work.
Well, I'm grateful that you do the work. I'm grateful that we've connected. I feel like we're sort of kindred spirits, separated by a whole Midwest and a number of states in between, but hooray for Zoom.
Yes.
If people would like to connect with you or follow you online, what's the best places for them to do that? You got a pretty good Instagram. I think they should follow you on Instagram.
I do, but this is the thing, is Instagram is the place that I'm keeping most private from like my public ministry. I do a lot of work.
The Instagram
no. I do a lot of work. I do a lot of work on Facebook, but a lot of my advocacy is on Instagram. So I would say follow my stories on Instagram, which is at Black Kelsey, all one word. Or Kelsey Brown on Facebook. I post a lot of stuff there, and a lot of the advocacy work that I do, I post publicly there, not just for folks who are my friends. So that's what I would suggest. Follow Jehu's Table has an Instagram and a Facebook. Give that a like, and see what we're doing in our little corner of the kingdom here in Brooklyn.
Yay. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so delighted that you made time and space for us, and I hope you get a good nap after this, if that's in your future.
Oh, amen.
Right? Awesome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye, friends.